My name is Soraya, and you are listening to Wild Roots. In this episode, we are going to be speaking with essay journalist Laura Jean Schneider, or LJ for short, on how a hiking journey in the desert gave her the insight and courage to literally walk away from a most harmful industry once seen as a most privileged way of life.
I fell into this infatuation with this cowboy romantic ideal of the West and horses and cattle and sort of this adventurous lifestyle. And the first time I had really traversed cattle country afoot, realizing, God, like they weren't being managed very closely. So certain areas were absolutely degrading. There was erosion. Idea of the conception of suffering was that when I became aware of how my personal relationships with these animals, and cattle in particular, seeing how they felt and emoted, and then thinking of what that means to consume a substance that has had that capacity.
So join us in one woman's brave story to publish openly about her decision to leave ranching behind for good, despite the controversies, and how her decision to do so has led her to a more fulfilled life.
I am from the Midwest originally, and I'm from a large family. I have 9 siblings, and I grew up in a rural area with a subsistence-based background. When I turned 18, I moved to Montana and sort of traveled through the West and found myself on the East Coast to finally complete a bachelor's degree in English language and literature. And after moving to New Mexico, I went back to school and got a MFA in fiction writing. And currently I live in Port Townsend, Washington, and I have a gardening and landscaping business called Must Like Plants. And I've done a few other different types of employment here, but that's predominantly what I'm focusing on.
So what is your ranching history, and how did you get into ranching originally?
I did not come from a ranching family. Definitely agricultural on both my mother and father's side of the family. So I did grow up with agriculture around me, and both sets of my grandparents raised cattle and other livestock. So I grew up with that around me, and I was always drawn. As a little girl, I was pretty horse obsessed, and I that sort of fell into this infatuation with this cowboy romantic ideal of the West and horses and cattle and sort of this adventurous lifestyle. And that, I would say that horses led me to ranching, and I was first exposed to ranching when I moved to Montana when I turned 18. And I worked at a summer camp that had big cattle ranches surrounding it. Was pretty intrigued, and the next summer I got a job at one of those ranches, which was about a 10,000 acre ranch, where I was in charge of running the guest riding program. So it was a dude ranch. That was my first taste of working cattle, horseback, of cowboy culture, of all of it. And while it was pretty brusque, an initial introduction and not exactly entirely welcoming. It was, I did want to be part of it, and I was just really driven to join it.
You're right, I suppose. It's sort of a romantic Americana like image that personally I just can't relate to. I feel like there's a lot of people who really try to hold on to that image for their sake of identity
Yes.
so strongly in this country. So, can you tell us sort of what your take on or perception of the industry now versus while you were a part of it? And what was your turning point for deciding to leave the industry?
Sure. My my initial feelings about ranching were on it really fed my it fed my ego in a way, because I felt like I had made it into this exclusive males club. Basically, I had worked my way into an extremely masculine way of life, and I felt like I was constantly needing to prove myself as being worthy of part of that. So a lot of it's just a lot of overworking and over trying, and trying to be sort of all things to all people, and racing from making dinner after a branding to from the branding itself, from gathering the cattle in the morning, from cleaning up afterwards while everyone else is relaxing, just sort of feeling like I had to run circles around everyone to just prove that I was worth being there. And at that point, that was worth it to me. And I felt at the time that I was doing something that was really special and avant-garde, because most of the ranches that I was working on were practicing a form of range management that has been made really popular by Alan Savory, who wrote the book Holistic Management and has started Holistic Management International. And you're probably very familiar with his work. He sort of has started this trend of what people are calling holistic grazing or planned grazing, which is essentially mimicking the traffic of wild herds across landscapes. So basically, he did a lot of work actually in Africa, and working with desertification and the degradation of brittle landscapes by livestock. And while I think some of the work he's implemented absolutely has merit value, my criticism now is, why are we raising mass amounts of livestock just for consumption? We don't need meat and leather, in my opinion, and yet cattle particularly are just raised solely because we have a preference for those substances, essentially.
Yeah.
So at the time, I totally bought into that, thinking I was just being a steward of land, and the fact that I was raising grass-fed and finished cattle was really important to me, because they were able to operate in this landscape without having the confinement of a feedlot experience. Yet they were in an environment that they have not evolved to adapt to, or at this point, I find it almost humorous to see cattle in some of these landscapes, because
They just look out of
they just
place.
yes, exactly.
Yeah. It's I mean, seeing cows across the desert Southwest landscape, they look so odd, and it really is comical.
Yeah, that's something that really resonated with me I did a when I did my hike this spring, the Arizona National Scenic Trail, where a lot of the federal land that was um, being grazed by black Angus cattle in this really arid, brittle, dry environment. It just seemed just unnecessary to both the animals and the landscape. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, and certainly to the degree that there's this great demand for beef, that of itself is very bizarre to me. The demand is so huge as if it's an absolute necessity, and it isn't.
right, it's not. And beef beef consumption is, I mean, people are eating more beef than they ever have, from what I have research, it seems to point toward that direction, and it's solely an appetite based.
Yes.
Really I feel like it's really a luxury item as well, and there's, I don't know if it's an exclusively American fascination or fascination with a very romantic ideal that is, it really informs our culture around food. And beef is sort of like the man's, the man's food, the man's meal. It's interesting to see how women are used in the advertising of meat and consumption, and it's kind of a real picture of excess, I think, and appetite as opposed to actual need.
It is definitely a lot like an addiction. I mean, it's quite the definition of addiction, something that's harmful to oneself or to others, and something that people aren't willing to give up. And clearly that's exactly what's coming from this industry. There's a lot of harm to wildlife, to the environment, and to ourselves
Right.
as well.
Yes, absolutely. It is, there was as a grass-fed beef producer, I had a whole litany of arguments about why grass-fed beef was actually good for you. There's all of these sort of rote facts that producers, they to bring people over to the other side, and also a lot of it is just being able to market a premium product, which I had a lot of angst around, frankly, because here I was
Yeah.
producing something that, frankly, I could not have afforded to eat on had I not been the actual producer.
Right.
It wasn't
Right.
something I could even afford to buy in a supermarket. The prices that other people were paying for my product, it really was only serving a certain class of people. It was not as though this great nutrition was available to all classes of individuals.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Going back to your hike, I've done many, many miles of long distance backpacking in the West, including the Arizona Trail, just
Oh,
as you have.
amazing.
Yeah. And a lot of people don't know this about these hikes, especially in the West, is that you are sharing a vital resource with these cows, and that is water.
Yeah.
And yeah, especially in places like the Arizona Trail, you basically have to get it when you can find it. And it is most likely going to be filled with cow poop,
Yes.
whether it's a natural spring or a trough. So a lot of people don't realize that that's what hikers deal with, and it's a resource that's being polluted. And I feel like ranchers should go on a long distance hike like these, and just to realize how much cow poop they will have to actually filter.
I absolutely gained that perspective this time around. In fact, it was real enlightening to me to take a long walkabout like this for the first time. It was my first through hike, and the first time I had really traversed cattle country afoot. My experience in the past was I was all horseback. It was I was in work mode. It was sort of native territory to me. It was a familiar landscape. I didn't look at it askance. And this time, with 3 years to kind of reflect from my leaving, which I believe was really spurred by a continuing internal discontent of questioning what I was doing and why. For me, ranching included a lot of disassociation, because there are a lot of brutal aspects that this way of life is fundamentally shaped around branding, castrating, all of the medical type procedures that happen without any anesthesia, roping and choking things down, and broken legs and kicked dogs, and just it's a violent culture in a lot of ways. So here I am, trekking on these paths afoot, feeling at first like nostalgic. Oh, look at the cattle. This makes me, what cute little calves. This feels so familiar. And then realizing, God, like they're not being, in this case, it appeared that they weren't being managed very closely. So certain areas were absolutely degrading. There was erosion. And I remember the first tank I came to, where I was like, oh, water. And then just looking at the water and thinking, wow, yeah. And it's not just me who shares this water out, especially in those arid landscapes. It is every other creature. Um, and so it's not as though, I mean, I have a filtration system, thankfully, but everything else doesn't. All the other animals that rely on that source of water don't have that luxury.
That's an excellent point, because it's not just our resource or the cow's resource, it's everybody's resource.
It is, and while absolutely ranchers have invested a lot in infrastructure and water development, for sure a lot of those tanks that we get water out of on the Arizona Trail would not exist without the rancher putting them in for his livestock. So there has to be an acknowledgement of that is actually benefiting us and other wildlife in the area. But fundamentally, I guess what does that stand for? Do the ends justify the means?
I've thought about this too, that if it weren't for the cattle industry, maybe trails like the Arizona Trail would be less doable to a degree.
Mm-hmm.
Then again, I think that if the industry wasn't there in the first place, that we would have a less degraded landscape with more naturally occurring springs. Many of these historical springs have been degraded beyond repair in certain areas where cows are continually grazing. And I have to keep reminding myself that it's not the cow. Because I get so frustrated at the sight of them. Like, there's cows out here, and why are they allowed to graze on the Gila River? And but it's not fueled by the animal; it's fueled by the demand.
Well, that's exactly it. No one would actually ranch and produce and sell cattle if there was no demand for it. So it's hard to actually fault. In some regards, it's hard to actually fault the ranchers themselves. And a lot of times, it's generations of people who have been doing this. And while there is this fierce pride and romantic attachment to tradition involved, separating that from a way of life that, frankly, it is so specific, and the skill set is so specific that it's pretty hard to get jobs outside of that industry if that's what you've done your whole life. So definitely, though, every rancher is trying to make a profit, and if beef didn't have a value, they would not be ranching.
Still, a lot of people don't realize what is happening on our public lands, and their public lands are being overgrazed and misused. In the Gila, for instance, you see a lot of bank erosion from the cattle. Could you speak to this at all?
Well, actually, I ran cattle on the Gila.
Wow.
That was one of the ranches I worked for. We ran yearlings and cow-calf pairs on the Gila, and right in that area above, sort of above Reserve, New Mexico. And yes, I can speak to the. I guess at the time I thought it was annoying when people, hunters or hikers or other people using it right for recreation, would leave gates open, or that was kind of the biggest thing for us was. And often these gates are impossible to open and close. I mean, I have had so many my shoulder was like perpetually bruised living, because I don't know what it is about gates, but they could be a lot more hiker friendly.
It's just funny because I know about these gates.
Yes, you know about gates. Riding horseback and having to jump off and get the gate, it was ridiculous. But that was kind of that was sort of the as far as it went with thinking about hikers, when I was horseback all the time. It was just like, maybe we can make these gates a little easier for people to open, and they wouldn't, just not be able to close them and whatever. But I think I also think that more people would recreate on federal land if cattle weren't such an issue, because they like to congregate in cleared areas like campground. They're curious, especially yearling cattle. and they're quite social often, and that's no fault of theirs. It's just this odd juxtaposition of recreational space and cow shit, and it takes you really outside of the outdoors, wild, quote quote in quotes, wild experience. A lot of people maybe who just have, just like weekend warrior types are looking at.
They're truly sites of domesticating our national forests and other public lands. And after a while, that's all the life you see out on certain trails. It's so depressing to me as a biologist, and I just get so thrilled when I come across a cougar track or a bear track, thinking, thank goodness they're still around. I mean, truly.
Yeah, I mean, we have altered the Western landscape significantly by introducing this non-native species and introducing fencing.
Yes.
I mean, that's another huge one. You know, the open range way of running cattle is almost non-existent anymore. There are certain places that graze together in like associations where they're utilizing a much larger unfenced space, and managing horseback to run them as one herd, and therefore they can keep them in much larger spaces, which allows for a greater freedom of wildlife movement in those spaces. But that has just completely shaped how those spaces are used.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much you know about wildlife services or anything like that, but it's like the ranching industry is a direct threat to all of wildlife.
There is a huge tension between protecting a valuable commodity, in this case, livestock, and the natural predatory instincts of predators. I mean, of large carnivores. And several of the ranches that I worked on in the past had packs of the Mexican gray wolves on them. We dealt with some depredation from bears. We did have some depredation from the wolves, but frankly, coyotes were more of an issue than anything, and those are very common in the West. And I think any livestock producer would have to be able to account for some level of loss. That just goes with business. Is that, I mean, there are so many variables when you are dependent on the weather and the landscape. I mean, there's too many variables to not look at that factor. But there's a lot of, I mean, in New Mexico, there was a ton of hostility against wolves, and I think that just plays into sort of a larger cultural anxiety against wolves.
Something that should be.
Right, and something that is part of a healthy ecological system, and yet it's difficult when humans take it upon themselves to introduce or to reintroduce a species in an area that has not supported that animal for some time. How that, again, it is impossible to actually calculate how that will impact that environment. And often there are unexpected results. For instance, you know, the elk in New Mexico, in areas that I ranched in, there was such an overpopulation because we didn't have larger apex predators. We needed more lions. We needed, larger predators to help keep the numbers of those herds to a healthier level, instead of seeing sort of diseased and emaciated individuals, because there was too much competition for grazing. And then there's competition that livestock introduce as well. And for ranchers, cattle have an economic value. They're almost like walking dollar signs, and elk don't, unless you're leading out hunts for trophy bulls. So it's purely economics.
It is purely economics, and I don't think that ecosystems should have to suffer for economics. But as far as the loss, like you said, it comes with the territory. I mean, you're essentially putting out a prey item out there. But sometimes I feel like ranchers don't want to accept any loss whatsoever, and they go out of their way to eliminate any loss by killing wildlife, and that comes with terrible consequences.
Well, that's an unrealistic expectation, I personally think. Um, Cattle, we have bred domestic cattle to, we have sort of bred the natural defenses out of domestic cattle. Like, no longer are they sort of more
Right.
of the Corriente or Longhorn type where they have a significant set of horns. They're wiry and wily and very agile, sharp hooves. Like they could do some, they could actually do some damage against a predator on their own, and they don't need sort of human protection, sort of like beast versus beast, as opposed to
Yeah.
um, the animals
Hmm.
that we have for beef in this landscape are polled. They don't have horns. They're large and bulky, so we can have more steaks. They're not. I mean, I feel for the cattle in this situation
Hmm.
because they are some of these environments that I have either ran cattle myself or seen them. It's absolutely it's wild. You're just like, how did a cow even get here? What would they actually do? They're sort of sitting ducks in a lot of ways.
Yeah, yeah. It's. I mean, absolutely. It's they're an artificially selected domesticated animal
Yeah,
turned loose into the wild. I
yeah,
mean, it's bizarre.
it is. People don't look at roving packs of feral dogs or feral cats.
Exactly. How has your life changed since you left the industry?
How has my life changed? Well, I gained an entirely different perspective on an industry that I thought would always be a large part of my life. And I was not able to adequately or accurately critique it while I was in it, in the midst of it, because there's such a dissociative component to just brace yourself through the day to do some of the things you just, that the job just necessitates. And the farther that I get from those active day to day chores and procedures, the more that I realize how, for a very long time, that has unsettled me, and that my participation was really dependent on me distancing myself from what I was doing in order for me to be able to do it. I think I disagree strongly with the concept that we still need to hot iron brand cattle, or that we can just cut parts off their body with anesthesia. I mean, they're living beings. They're large mammals, and I no longer eat. It's not something I can participate in anymore. I feel as though animals. I have seen cattle have the ability to grieve. They form complex friendships. They have complex herd orders. They are playful. They are easily trainable. I was just reading a study in the uh, that was published recently about the of cattle to recognize other cattle from photographs, actually, as members that they preferred. And I think that we don't have of how aware other creatures are, and we've made a lot of assumptions. I mean, people in this country would never consider eating a chimpanzee because they're so close to our human roots. You just privilege certain animals over others, and
Yeah.
I just find that really distasteful.
For a very short period of my childhood, I grew up on a small dairy farm, and I
Okay.
remember making connections with some of the cows there, which are absolutely sentient.
Yeah.
And one of my favorites was 137. She didn't have a name. She was 137. And she was so sweet. She was such a sweet animal, and I used to put my arms around her neck, and she used to lift me up and then put me back down. It was sort of like receiving a hug from her. So cows are not just these dumb creatures, though we've created a lot of vulnerabilities in them, but they are certainly not mindless creatures.
Yeah, I think I addressed that in the essay that I wrote for High Country News, is that the concept was introduced to me of the consumption of suffering, and that we cannot know all. I mean,
Yes.
we're discovering, like, scientists and biologists are discovering every day, oh, look, jellyfish have this ability to XYZ, or salmon can feel and recognize this or that, or all the complexities that it takes us so many years and decades, centuries even, to understand, to just understand some very basic concepts, like, for instance, the Holsteins and facial recognition. Really, should we be shocked by that? Like, they have brain complex herd order. And I remember reading a piece, and I think the New York Times, about it. It was written as though it were some sort of like shocking revelation that cattle use different calls to, if when they're in distress, or when they're ovulating, or when they're goofing around, or when they're calling for their calves. Idea of the consumption of suffering was that when I became aware of how my personal relationships with these animals, and cattle in particular, seeing how they felt and emoted, and then thinking of what that means to consume a substance that has had that capacity, felt that feels really weighty to me, as though I am aware that they can feel pain and process emotions and suffer. So willingly putting that into my body felt I just couldn't do it anymore. I was really unsettled by the fact that I could eat something that could have emotions and feel pain.
Yeah, those findings seem something like of a second nature to me. Like the fact that they're still being published on, I mean, is good, because we are truly digging deeper into the consciousness of other creatures. But like to just know that they feel and all the rest shouldn't be a surprise at this point. So is there anything else you might like to share with our listeners before we close today?
Definitely reading the work of Carol J. Adams, who's an animal rights activist and a vegan, and a feminist, was pretty integral to my making this decision. I read several of her books. She has a great one called Feminism in the Defense of Animals, which looks specifically at the commodification of women and livestock, and how they are paired in marketing and beyond, which is interesting. But she also has a great her canon of books is pretty incredible, and I think any of them would be a great place for a reader to start, because she uses just a lot of evidence, photographs. So it's a lot less about opinion than it is about facts, or at least there's numbers, which kind of satisfies a lot more of the. She's not just writing opinion pieces. She has studies and statistics behind her work, which I feel gives it a validity that many other texts lack. Like, personal essays are powerful and are a way that I often find something that really resonates with me. But I think there are a lot of people who feel a comfort in studies and research, and I think the melding of the two makes a really powerful argument. And I would ask people to just be more aware of why they're eating what they're eating. What is eating in you? I feel like I crave meat and animal products when I am not taking care of myself, or when I'm under stress, and that made me think, why is that? It's like I'm going to reach for the body parts of something else when I'm not taking care of my own body.
Yeah, cravings really point to something else in your life, or some other aspects of yourself not being nurtured or taken care of in some way, whether it's biological or physical or even emotionally.
Right. And then that makes me really realize, like, you are not feeding yourself. If you're wanting to feed yourself if you are, in a sense, suffering anxiety or stress or hunger or disassociating somehow, and you're wanting to just blindly, oddly to me, animal-based products are Americans' comfort food, which is totally examining in and of itself.
Yeah, they are.
Cheese and dairy, all of these, like, decadent, amazing. And I'm not a person who doesn't eat meat because I don't think it tastes good. I really want to put that out there, that I'm not a person who thinks that the taste and texture of animal products is repugnant. And no, I grew up very much entrenched in that. Absolutely, I have developed a taste for those things, and absolutely, I feel their absence. And yet, I cannot even I can't even put cream in my coffee without thinking about the cow that it came from, like thinking about dairies, thinking about what that stands for. It's a product that came from a cow that was meant for her calf, that her calf never got, that her calf is taken from her, and she never gets to nurse it. She never gets to see it. She mourns it. What does that mean when suffering and sorrow come through a product of one's body and you are using it to enjoy yourself? It's something I'm exploring right now.
Wow. Very well put, Laura Jean. Thank you so much. And I have one last question I would like to ask you, though I think you might have already answered it, but we'll see. So that question is, if you could share a special connection or experience that you have had with an animal or in nature.
Well, and I think that when we make ourselves available, perhaps even psychically, as a safe space, as an entity that is not out to cause harm, that I absolutely believe in the concept that animals are here to do their work on us, kind of like even in regards to domestic animals, where people think about training and connecting with their dogs or horses, for instance. I really think that they are here to say, humans, sit back. I have this work I need to do for you or on you. And
That's beautiful.
I don't know, this is kind of an odd experience, and it wasn't exactly in the wild, but it did involve the wild. Was actually when I was writing that essay for High Country News earlier this summer. I was house sitting here in Port Townsend on the little end of a little cul-de-sac, and I had the door open to, let the air in, and I was kind of frustrated about outlining this piece and where it was going, and I was really struggling with the personal aspect of it, of coming out in a way that's like, hey, actually, all this year and a half of ranch diaries that I wrote for you is, not that I take it all back, but like, look, I've changed my mind on this. Like, I don't agree with it anymore, and here's why. And anticipating sort of the negative feedback from specific people or from communities that I was completely enmeshed in. And anyway, I hear this little scratchy, hoppy sound, and I get up and I look, and right in the doorway is this juvenile crow. And he starts just screaming, like, you automatically tell that he was like, I'm hungry and lost, or I don't know what. I know that he showed up for a specific reason, but I had just actually made a pot of pinto beans that were on the stove, and I was like, oh, don't feed the wildlife. I had this overwhelming sense that this creature was really hungry, and so I fed him some beans out of my fingers as if they were a beak, and he ate these beans, and he's talking the whole time and kind of flopping around, and then he flew up onto the table and sat right on my laptop, and like right on the keyboard. Wow. And a million places that he could have gone, and he landed specifically on that. And after he was fed and his appetite was satiated, he hung around outside for maybe an hour, marched back in for one more go. He flew off over the backyard fence, and I never saw him again. So it was pretty cool. I had drew a crow as a medicine card that I drew actually for the new year. He was one of the animals that showed up, and I just took that as very symbolic and beautiful interaction.
Definitely sounds like a sign from nature saying, yes, do this, please write this.
Crow their medicine is about basically like speaking your truth, saying it how it is, putting it out there. And it was kind of the push I needed to say, all right, So screw what other people think. I'm gonna just write this is my story, and no one can take it away. It's my own truth.
Laura Jean, thank you so much for sharing your story with us. I really appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
This is Wild Roots. Thanks for listening.